In 2000, General Electric was worth $600 billion, making it America's most valuable company. It was the stock that every grandmother owned, the company Thomas Edison founded, representing a century of trust, innovation, and rock-solid dividends. Jack Welch, GE's legendary CEO, was named Manager of the Century by Fortune magazine. Investors worshipped him, business schools taught his methods, and every quarter like clockwork, GE beat earnings expectations. However, behind those perfect numbers was the most elaborate accounting fraud in American corporate history. This was a fraud so sophisticated, it took 2 decades to fully unravel, a fraud that destroyed $460 billion in shareholder value and left hundreds of thousands of workers without their promised pensions. This is how they did it. Before we continue, subscribe for real stories about corporate power, fraud, and the companies that shaped and destroyed modern America. Jack Welch became CEO of General Electric in 1981 when the company made everything from light bulbs to jet engines, refrigerators to power plants. But Welch had a different vision for the iconic American manufacturer. He introduced what he called the number one or number two rule, which meant every GE division had to be first or second in its market. If a division couldn't achieve this, it would be fixed, sold, or closed completely. Wall Street loved this approach because it promised ruthless efficiency, clear metrics, and most importantly, predictable growth. But there was a fundamental problem with this strategy. Manufacturing businesses are naturally cyclical, which means some quarters you win and some quarters you lose because markets go up and down. That's just economic reality. However, Welch promised Wall Street something that should have been impossible, which was consistent, predictable, double-digit earnings growth every single quarter with no exceptions. From 1981 to 2001, GE beat or met Wall Street expectations 46 out of 47 quarters, giving them a 98% success rate. In an economy that saw 2 recessions, oil shocks, and the dot-com crash, GE's earnings moved in only one direction, and that direction was up. How did they achieve this seemingly impossible consistency? The answer wasn't innovation or efficiency, but rather something called GE capital. In the 1990s, while investors saw GE as a manufacturing company making jet engines and refrigerators, the real money came from somewhere completely different. GE Capital, the company's financial services arm, was quietly becoming one of the largest banks in America. By 2000, GE Capital generated over 40% of GE's total profits, which most shareholders didn't fully understand. This is where the magic trick happened. Manufacturing divisions are transparent because you can count jet engines and see how many refrigerators were sold. But financial services are different because loans, derivatives, and insurance policies exist only on spreadsheets, and their value depends on assumptions, projections, and accounting estimates that can be manipulated. Welch used GE Capital as a giant cookie jar to smooth out the company's earnings. When a manufacturing division missed its quarterly target, GE Capital would magically produce extra profits to fill the gap. If they needed $200 million to hit the number this quarter, GE Capital found it every single time without fail. The analysts on Wall Street never questioned these numbers because GE's results were too consistent, too perfect, and too predictable to raise suspicion. And Jack Welch became something of a corporate deity in the business world. When he retired in 2001, his farewell package was worth an astonishing $417 million. Jeff Immelt took over as CEO in September 2001, which turned out to be perfect timing because it was just 3 days before September 11th changed everything. Jeff Immelt inherited what looked like a well-oiled machine, but in reality, it was a house of cards that was already starting to collapse. He had an impossible job because he had to maintain Jack Welch's magic trick while dealing with a completely different economic reality. The September 11th attacks devastated GE's aviation and insurance businesses overnight. Then, the 2008 financial crisis nearly killed GE Capital completely. But here's the thing that should have raised red flags. Immelt kept playing the same game. The earnings still beat expectations quarter after quarter, and the dividends still increased like clockwork. On the surface, nothing had changed at all. However, behind the scenes, the accounting became more creative, more aggressive, and more fraudulent than ever before. In 2009, the SEC launched an investigation into GE's accounting practices, and what they found was absolutely stunning. GE had been manipulating their numbers through 4 primary schemes that had been running for years. The first scheme involved what accountants call cookie jar reserves. GE maintained hidden reserves, which were secret pools of money tucked away in hundreds of different accounts across their global operations. When a quarter looked weak, they would release money from these reserves to boost profits. When a quarter looked too strong, they would add money to the reserves to save it for later. This way, earnings always hit the target, always stayed smooth, and always remained predictable. The SEC found that GE manipulated $5 billion in reserves between 1995 and 2004 alone. The second scheme involved revenue recognition games with their biggest products. GE sold jet engines, turbines, and locomotives, which are big-ticket items with complex payment terms. They use something called vendor financing, which sounds technical but is actually quite simple when you break it down. A customer wants to buy a $100 million jet engine but doesn't have the cash to pay for it upfront. GE Capital gives them a loan to buy the engine from GE. Then GE immediately recognizes the full $100 million as revenue, even though they're essentially lending money to someone to buy their own product. They're literally paying themselves with borrowed money and calling it a sale. If the customer defaults on the loan years later, GE Capital takes the loss at that future point. But the manufacturing division already booked the sale in a previous quarter, so by the time the loan goes bad, it's a different quarter, a different year, and a different problem for different managers. The third scheme is particularly cruel because it involved the pension fund for hundreds of thousands of workers. In the 1990s and 2000s, GE used wildly optimistic assumptions about investment returns to reduce their pension contributions, which freed up billions in cash that they could use elsewhere. They assumed the pension fund would earn 9.5% returns annually, which is incredibly aggressive for a pension fund. When the fund underperformed these optimistic projections, they didn't adjust their assumptions downward. They kept the same rosy projections year after year. This created a massive funding gap that would become someone else's problem decades later. By 2017, GE had a $31 billion pension deficit that workers would eventually pay for. The fourth scheme involved long-term care insurance policies that GE sold in the early 2000s. These are insurance products that pay for nursing homes and assisted living when people get old and need care. GE massively underestimated how many people would file claims and how expensive that care would become over time. By 2017, GE had a $6.2 billion shortfall in their long-term care insurance reserves, which was an enormous hole in their finances. They knew the policies were underpriced from the beginning, and they knew the claims would eventually exceed their reserves. But adjusting the reserves would hurt their quarterly earnings, so they just waited and hoped the problem would solve itself. It didn't. In 2009, the SEC made GE pay a $50 million fine for these accounting violations. But the truly outrageous part is that GE didn't have to admit any wrongdoing as part of the settlement. They just paid the fine and kept going with business as usual. If you're following this story so far, make sure you're subscribed for more true business scandals like this. You can only play accounting games for so long before reality catches up. And for GE, reality hit like a freight train starting in 2017. By 2017, GE was in complete freefall as their stock dropped from $31 per share to just $7 in less than 2 years. The dividend, which GE had paid continuously since 1899, was cut by 50%. Then it was cut again. Then it was eliminated entirely, which was unthinkable for such a historic American company. The truth came out piece by piece as investigators dug deeper. In October 2018, the Department of Justice charged 2 former GE executives with accounting fraud. The allegations were absolutely damning because they showed these executives had systematically manipulated earnings from 2015 to 2016 to hide the company's deteriorating financial condition from investors. But the real bombshell came from a forensic accountant named Harry Markopolos, who was the same person who had exposed Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme years earlier. In August 2019, Markopolos released a 175-page report with a brutal title that simply said GE, Accounting Fraud, with a subtitle claiming GE was hiding $38 billion in losses. His findings were absolutely explosive and detailed. He claimed GE understated its long-term care insurance liabilities by $18.5 billion, which was an enormous hidden time bomb. He claimed GE's oil and gas division was covering up massive losses through questionable accounting practices. He estimated that GE's true financial hole was actually larger than the combined frauds at Enron and WorldCom, which were 2 of the biggest corporate scandals in American history. GE denied everything immediately and called the report market manipulation by short sellers. They threatened lawsuits and attacked Markopolos' credibility. But the damage was already done because investors had lost faith. People fled from GE stock, and the price continued to collapse throughout 2019 and 2020. And then the human cost of this fraud became painfully clear to everyone watching. Over 20,000 GE workers lost their jobs in 2018 alone, which devastated communities across America. Retirees saw their pensions frozen after working for the company for decades. Some lost healthcare benefits they had counted on for their entire retirement. Factory towns where GE had been the anchor employer for generations experienced mass unemployment and economic devastation. In Schenectady, New York, where GE had employed over 40,000 workers at its peak, the workforce dropped to fewer than 4,000 workers. In Lynn, Massachusetts, a GE aviation plant that had operated for over 100 years faced permanent closure. These weren't just statistics on a spreadsheet, but real families and real communities that were destroyed. Meanwhile, the executives who created this disaster walked away wealthy beyond imagination. Jack Welch kept his $417 million retirement package without giving back a single dollar. Jeff Immelt walked away with $211 million in total compensation over his 16-year tenure as CEO. The two executives who were actually charged with fraud had very different outcomes than the workers. One settled his case without admitting guilt, and the other case is still pending in court years later. Meanwhile, workers who had spent 30 years on the factory floor watched their retirement savings evaporate and their communities fall apart. By 2021, GE was forced to split itself into three separate companies focused on aviation, healthcare, and energy. The conglomerate model that Jack Welch built over 2 decades was completely dead. The company Thomas Edison founded in 1892 was broken into pieces and sold for parts like a junked car. The SIEC investigation continued even after the breakup. In 2020, GE paid an additional $200 million fine for misleading investors about its insurance reserves and power business. Once again, there was no admission of wrongdoing as part of the settlement. What makes this story so deeply frustrating is that GE's fraud wasn't just about fake numbers on financial statements. It was about creating a corporate culture that prioritized short-term stock prices over long-term value creation. It was a culture that rewarded executives for hitting quarterly targets no matter how they achieved those targets or who got hurt in the process. The real victims of this fraud weren't sophisticated hedge funds that could absorb the losses. The victims were pension funds, retirement accounts, and individual investors who trusted that GE, the company that had operated successfully since 1892, was actually playing by the rules. GE stock was considered the safest investment in America for generations. It was the stock your grandfather owned and never sold. It was the stock that financial advisors put into conservative retirement portfolios for teachers, firefighters, and nurses. That trust was completely obliterated by executives who cared more about their bonuses than the people who built the company. And the darkest part of this entire story is that GE's playbook became a blueprint for other companies to follow. The use of financial services divisions to smooth out manufacturing earnings, the aggressive revenue recognition tactics, and the overly optimistic pension fund assumptions all became common practices across corporate America. How many other companies looked at what GE was doing and thought, if they can get away with it, why can't we? The total financial destruction is almost impossible to comprehend when you look at the numbers. At its peak in 2000, GE was worth $600 billion and was the most valuable company in the world. By 2018, it was worth just $140 billion. That means $460 billion in wealth was destroyed and simply vanished into thin air. GE's collapse is a reminder that perfect numbers usually hide imperfect truth. When a company beats Wall Street expectations 46 out of 47 quarters, you shouldn't celebrate that consistency. You should be asking serious questions about how that's even possible. The fraud at General Electric wasn't a sudden scandal that happened overnight. It was a 20-year con job, carefully built on accounting tricks, hidden reserves, and the willingness of Wall Street analysts to ignore obvious red flags because the investment returns looked so good quarter after quarter. Jack Welch was called Manager of the Century by the business press. Maybe he earned that title. But his real legacy isn't innovation or efficiency or transforming American business. His legacy is proof that you can fool everyone, even sophisticated Wall Street investors, for decades if your story is good enough and your numbers are smooth enough. The workers who built GE's jet engines and turbines, the retirees who depended on their pensions after 30 years of service, and the investors who trusted this American icon are the ones who paid the ultimate price. Meanwhile, the executives who created this disaster walked away with hundreds of millions of dollars and faced almost no consequences. That's the dark truth behind General Electric, the biggest corporate fraud that nobody talks about. For more true stories about legendary companies and the secrets behind their downfall, subscribe to the channel.